So, peers in the House of Lords have been debating and voting on Brexit since Easter, defeating the government no fewer than 14 times. Today, several MPs have voiced their anger at what they say is the upper chamber becoming drunk with their own prejudices, inflicting 4 defeats on the government in just one evening. Meanwhile, the Daily Mail says it's time to pull the plug on the House of Lords. They've accused them of being traitors in ermine who loathe democracy and listed just some of the peers they say have betrayed the votes of 17.4 million people. Joining Lord Hennessy here are Jacob Rees-Mogg, who heads the European Research Group of Conservative MPs, and hopefully Labour MP Alison McGovern. In fact, I think I can hear her coming into the studio. First of all, Lord Hennessy, are you completely obsessed with the European Union, as Jacob Rees-Mogg has said about some of the Lords who defeated the government?
I think there's a special anthropology to their lordships when it comes to Europe, because think of their age. The House is full of people who, in their political and public life, strove mightily to get us into the EEC and to make it work once we were in. And they're sitting there seeing their life's work diminished. Not just diminished, but taken apart. And also, they're in the House of Lords, there are people who've made it their life's mission in politics to get us out of the EEC, or EU, as it now is. And also for them it is very anxiety-inducing because they think that it's been caveated away by all the talk of a customs union of some kind. And so you have people who in their twilight years, I have to be careful using language of my colleagues like that, can see their professional lives being shredded. But I think the House of Lords, for me, Parliament is a great oratorio. I'm a romantic about Parliament. But the House of Lords' function, above all, is to provide the recitative. But it always has to be the arias in the House of Commons, Jacob's people, Alison's people, not us.
Right, but are they defying the will of the people?
The will of the people is a very tricky concept. I'm one of those people who believes, though I am a Remainer, was a Remainer, that we have to accept the result of the referendum. I voted against the idea of paving the way to a second referendum. So I think that one has to respect the will of the people, but it's very difficult in any country when you run a system of plebiscitary democracy, referenda, up against representative democracy.
Right.
The friction is immense, and this is an expression of that as well.
Right. Well, let me welcome Alison McGovern, the Labour MP, into the studio. But first of all, listening to that, Jacob Rees-Mogg, do you think the Lords has overstepped the mark now, outlived its use?
Well, let me begin by saying that I can say, and actually mean it, that I have the greatest respect for Lord Hennessy, and listening to him explain what's going on in the Lords is just such a beautifully clear understanding of the situation.
You're very kind.
And, well, no, it's absolutely true. I mean, there are, I think, 2 people in the country who properly understand the Constitution. You're one, and Vernon Bogdanor is
I think he's in awe of you, Peter.
He's very, very kind.
And so I think...
My dad, Meg Russell, is the third.
So I think we're very lucky to have Lord Hennessy on, and what he has to say is so important. And the definitions he uses are, I think, spot on. I think you do see people in the Lords whose life work is being threatened. Are they challenging the will of the people? My concern is that some, but not all of the amendments, and I could go through which ones if you wanted, break the conventions. I think the convention that manifesto commitments are not overridden in the Lords is important. And I think saying that the Conservatives didn't win an overall majority and therefore their manifesto commitments don't count is a specious argument, and therefore the vote on the customs union particularly was the Lords overstepping the mark. When it comes to Henry VIII powers, on the other hand, I think the House of Lords was doing exactly its constitutional job as a revising chamber.
Right.
So I think there are bits of both within.
So do you agree, though, with Jacob Rees-Mogg that when it comes to manifesto commitments, the Salisbury Convention, that the Lords don't vote against government manifesto commitments, although Labour said much the same when it came to the customs union, that actually the Lords has overstepped the mark?
I've been worried about the Salisbury Convention for a long time now, particularly nearly 10 years ago now, I think, 8, when the House of Lords was debating, and nearly filibustered actually, which we don't do, on the revised constituency boundaries, because the Salisbury Convention was lying in shards on the floor of the chamber, and the Lib Dems were saying, well, we never signed up to it in the first place, it was a Conservative Labour thing in 1945. So, and I suggested that we needed another convention, but we didn't get round to doing that. And also manifestos these days are like concertinas. There are so many pledges. But I do take Jacob's point very seriously. We do need to tread very carefully.
Right. But did they overstep the mark, yes or no?
Well, I voted for the customs union thing, So it's a slightly disapproving look from my old friend, but I have to say, be honest about it.
I think there is a problem with this convention and that's brought about by the referendum and the way in which that was conducted, because of course there was no manifesto on either side in the referendum.
But there were manifestos, of course, going into the elections.
That's right.
The general
but then,
election
unfortunately, we're in this situation of a hung parliament. Now, you know, Jacob's entitled to his view that the Conservative government did, you know, they stood on a manifesto, and that the convention refers to the government's manifesto, whatever the actual result. But I think the public don't really see that. I think what they see is a hung parliament that's desperately trying to reflect what's going on in Britain in a democratic way, and that just means that nobody's manifesto can override anyone else's.
And don't they just have the right to put forward what they really think? These are sincerely held views, Jacob Rees-Mogg, just like yours is a sincerely held view. Maybe they genuinely believe in the Lords, those who defeated the government or helped defeat the government, that the UK is better off staying in the European Economic Area or EFTA after we leave the EU.
But this is where the constitutional conventions are so important. The House of Lords, other than the 1911 Parliament Act as amended, has very, very significant powers. It could, in fact, disrupt the whole of any government's legislative programme. It has an absolute veto on secondary legislation. There'll be many issues where they feel very strongly, but our constitution works because the unelected and unaccountable second chamber obeys the conventions. This was the problem with Nick Clegg's reform of the House of Lords, because it assumed the conventions would just stay regardless of the new composition. And actually the conventions have been under change, in flux, since 1999 when the hereditary peers went. And we do have an issue as to how the conventions are now working, and it troubles me that they're not working well at the moment.
Yes, we clearly do have a problem in the situation of a hung parliament, where we're dealing with, you know, possibly the big political issue of my generation, certainly, and we have a House of Commons that's quite divided, where it's, as I was saying, desperately trying to grapple with how you reflect what's going on in Britain when people are dealing with this big issue. And then the House of Lords is left in a position where Salisbury Convention doesn't really hold, because nobody really won the election. So what are they supposed to do, apart from give, and I, you know, don't agree with an unelected House, to be quite honest, but
you don't mind them agreeing with you on this?
Well, I think they're in a terrible position, because all they can do is give their best advice as they see it.
I mean, isn't the truth that you're just upset with the Lords because they're not doing what you would like them to do? They're not agreeing with you on Brexit. You opposed the reform in 2012. Alison McGovern, I suppose you could say conversely, is happy with what the Lords is doing because she agrees with the views that they're putting forward on Brexit. This is just sour grapes.
This is, I think, an unduly cynical view of political life, that I think the constitutional conventions are important, and that's why I differentiated between those areas where I think the House of Lords is doing its constitutional role. I think it's completely entitled to overturn Henry VIII powers, because they weren't a manifesto commitment, they weren't an issue of debate in the last general election.
Hardly represents taking back control.
Well, that's a separate issue. I'm actually very nervous about Henry VIII powers. That's a separate discussion.
I totally agree.
But the Lords was acting within the conventions on that. On the customs union, and indeed taking out the date, it seemed to me it was going against the conventions, because it was going against the very clear will of the House of Commons on a manifesto.
What do you say to that?
I voted against taking out the date, but I think in the big picture, I'm a rotten forecaster, I must admit.
Well, you're not alone there.
I think when it comes to the big showdowns, they're on the floor of the House of Commons, and I think pretty well everybody in their Lordship's House knows that. But it's a question of at what point you stop the ping-pong, which is going to be another great psychodrama. Yes. This European question is like no other. It disturbs our atoms to the most remarkable degree, puts stress within parties. It even strains friendship. I'm glad to say Jacob and I's friendship is intact.
For now. No, that seems very cynical. I mean, do you think it's time to pull the plug on the House of Lords?
I don't think pull the plug is the right answer, but I think you're going to need to look at how the conventions work. I think this came up...
What does that mean, Jacob? I mean, is it time to get rid of the House of Lords?
It came up with the issue on secondary legislation relating to a work and pensions, essentially financial measure. That was an issue that has been left unsettled. It's come up again with how the Salisbury-Addison Convention works. I agree with Lord Hennessy that it needs to be clear you do need to update these conventions from time to time so that people understand the framework under which they're working. There is a place, an effective place, for an unaccountable revising chamber, but it needs to operate within the conventions, and we need to be clear what those conventions are.
Right.
And
All right.
Since 1999, we've been much less clear on the conventions because the appointed peers have felt they had much more legitimacy than the hereditary peers.
All right, well, let's talk about